Thank you very, very much indeed. Thanks for coming out tonight and for welcoming me to Canberra. It's a great privilege to be here at ANU on my first ever trip to Australia. So, when I first began doing the reporting for this book, which is the Antidote, which is starts off by looking at what's wrong with the culture of positive thinking, and what the alternatives might be. I went to a motivational seminar in Texas, which was part of a series called Get Motivated. There's an exclamation mark in the name, and I was attempting to pronounce it then. And one of the speakers actually was George W. Bush, which is strange. His job now, post-presidency, is to go around telling people how to be a success. But one of the other speakers was a guy called Robert Schuller, who is a veteran self-help author, and also in his other job, the founder of the largest church in America constructed entirely out of glass. And he told us that if we wanted to succeed in life, in anything, if we wanted to enjoy guaranteed success, all we had to do was to eliminate the word impossible from our vocabularies. In other words, focus only on the possibility that everything can work out fine, and everything will work out fine. And so the rest of the motivational seminar passed as it did, and there was lots of jumping up and leaping out of your chair and cheering, and this is really awful for a British person, because we don't do that. And anyway, a few months later, I was reading the news at home, and I saw that the largest church in America, constructed entirely out of glass, had filed for bankruptcy. And then since this book went to the printers, it turns out that Get Motivated itself has also filed for bankruptcy. So to be clear, I think it is important to be clear, I'm not mocking the fact that sometimes people file for bankruptcy, but I do think that there's clearly, I worked for a newspaper in 2013, so I guess you have to remain open to the possibility of bankruptcy at all times. But I do think that there's something wrong. It's sort of my starting point, I suppose. There's something wrong with these guaranteed recipes for success when the people whose job it is to promote them can't even guarantee their own success at promoting them. So mainly what I want to talk about for the sort of first half of what I want to say today is something much less frivolous, I suppose. It's very, very serious, which is what happened on Mount Everest in 1996. I'm sure many of you have read John Krakauer's book, Into Thin Air, and if you've read that, you'll know that in 1996, what happened is that 8 climbers died in one 24-hour period, and I think 15 died over the course of that summer's climbing season, which was not only obviously a tragedy, but a really strange and inexplicable one, because clearly today, if you have the money and you're willing to put in the time, you can pay people to train you and take you to the top of Everest. It's no longer an unknown quantity. Yet still, as recently as 1996, there was this extraordinary death toll. And the strange thing is that no one's ever really been able to explain why it happened. John Krakauer has some interesting theories about the personalities of some of the lead climbers. There were a few problems with guide ropes that hadn't been put in the correct place, but there was no extremely unusual weather. There was nothing really that gets you all the way to an explanation of why this should have unfolded the way that it did. What happened, if you don't know, is basically that there was a traffic jam at a place called the Hillary Step, a couple of 100 feet short of the summit. And all these climbers became bottlenecked and bunched together, so it delayed their smooth progression up to the top and down the mountain. The protocol when you're climbing Everest is that you have to observe very strict turnaround times. If you don't make it to a certain point by a certain time, then you have to turn around even if the going seems good. But what happened is that lots of these very professional climbers, they got to this bottleneck, it delayed them, And instead of turning around, they pushed on and on, with the result that many of them reached the summit far too late in the day, hours after the latest acceptable turnaround times. And some of them ended up descending in darkness and in the worst of Everest's weather at night. And that's when some of them came to grief. And nobody's ever really been able to clearly explain why. But it turns out that there was somebody else in the area that day, not on the mountain itself, but in the foothills, who, when I first heard about his story, I thought would be the last person that you would imagine would have anything useful to say about explaining the causes of a mountaineering tragedy. He was a burned-out stockbroker from Indiana called Christopher Case, and he was literally just on a hiking holiday. He'd got sick of his job, he was changing professions, he needed a break, so he went to the foothills of the Himalayas to go on a rather easy kind of walking trip. But the more he discovered about this tragedy, and he met people who'd been involved in the rescue effort coming back down off the mountain, things like this. The more he discovered about it, the more he told me it haunted him and gnawed at him. He said it was as if it had happened to a member of his own extended family. And he ended up dedicating several years of his professional life to trying to understand what had happened. I think the reason it haunted him was because it reminded him of something that he'd seen happen again and again in the corporate world that he'd got so sick of. And what would happen is that, some corporate leader, this is what he would witness when he was a consultant and a stockbroker, some corporate leader would announce a very big, ambitious goal. They'd make it public. They'd go to great lengths to get all their employees to commit to it very publicly. Try to motivate everybody to rally behind this ambitious goal. And then slowly information would start to creep in to suggest that maybe it was actually an unwise goal. Maybe it was going to cause problems elsewhere in the company. Perhaps even it was going to bring the company to its knees. And naturally this would make people feel nervous and worried and uncertain. But then this is the interesting part. In an effort to get rid of that negative feeling of uncertainty and nervousness, so allergic were they to feeling it, that they would commit even more strongly to the original goal. Because they couldn't stand feeling this uncertainty, they would end up pursuing the goal with even more vigor, and that is when things would go badly wrong. So Chris Case now is an expert in organizational behavior at George Washington University in the States. And when he goes around and talks about this, I think he understands how annoying it is for mountaineers to hear him say, here's a lesson from the world of business that can help you climb Everest. But the interesting thing is that there is evidence that this same psychological pattern happens among mountain climbers. There is a study, for example, from 1963, in which a group of psychologists based at Berkeley University followed a group of American climbers who were aiming to get to the top of Everest. They actually were very committed psychologists. They followed them literally as far as base camp on the mountain. They had them keep very, very detailed diaries of their thoughts and emotions and their plans at every stage of the training and of the ascent. And some of these climbers had decided to try a very dangerous route to the summit that had never before been successfully achieved. And when their diaries were analysed later, this same pattern could be detected. They would receive some problematic information about their plan. Maybe there was some question as to whether their equipment was up to the task, or the weather patterns didn't look at all good for pursuing this goal. It would make them feel nervous and worried, and they would record these emotions in their diaries. And then, apparently, because they wanted to get rid of those feelings, they would actually commit more strongly to the goal that it was being suggested they perhaps ought to abandon. They would commit even harder to that plan. And what happens, Chris Case argues, is that they had made the goal into a part of their identities. It was no longer just something they they wanted to achieve, if possible, a project. It was part of who they were, and they were so unwilling for who they were to be infected by insecurity and uncertainty in this fashion that they sort of managed to alchemize this incoming negative information into a reason to keep going. And there was an American mountaineer who was on Everest the day in 1996, watching the bottleneck from lower down through a telescope, who describes this effect that summits exert on climbers as almost literally magnetism. He says it draws people on. They no longer think clearly. They put aside their previous rational calculations. And to quote him, on a good day, you'll get away with it. And on a bad day, you'll die. So it's worth clarifying that the climbers in 1963 actually did get away with it, and that untried route was successfully achieved. And I think that Chris Case would agree we will never know for sure if that is what was going on in the minds of the climbers in 96. But the reason that I think this is such a vivid and interesting story is because I think it illustrates a pattern that explains what goes wrong with all sorts of our efforts to achieve happiness or success, no matter how you define that, whether success is getting to the top of a mountain or building a successful business or creating a loving family, or whether happiness is just feeling good, or whatever it means to you. We're so allergic to feeling uncertainty, negativity, insecurity, and failure that we focus above all on doing everything we possibly can to stamp those feelings out. And it's in stamping those feelings out with too much effort that we bring about the opposite effect and lead to the very fate that we were trying to avoid. So what I try to do in this book, in the most part, is to explore the opposite of that, this idea that I call the negative path to happiness, the idea that actually trying too hard to be happy makes people miserable, trying too hard to focus only on success brings about failure, and that actually we'd do better to turn towards these negative emotions, to find ways to sort of coexist with uncertainty and insecurity and other forms of negativity, and even to harness the power of negative thinking. I think when you look at the sort of extremes of positive thinking, like the stuff at the motivational seminar that I began with, a lot of people, probably most people in this audience, don't need telling that they probably aren't the route to happiness. There's been some fascinating research recently, for example, into self-help affirmations. Those phrases you're supposed to say to yourself in the mirror to make yourself into a better and happier person. You can buy whole books of these things. But it turns out that when people who already have low self-esteem repeat to themselves the phrase, "I am a lovable person," it makes them feel worse. Because it prompts them to generate counter-arguments. It just leaves them thinking like, no, I'm not as lovable. No, I'm not as lovable as I should be, or I'm not as lovable as other people. We've also learned that visualizing your goals, visualizing the successful achievement of your goals, often has the reverse outcome, contrary to the message of my least favorite self-help book, The Secret. And I know in visiting Australia, I'm in The Secret's home turf, so I need to watch out. In case there's anybody here who doesn't know the thesis of The Secret, by the way, it's that there is a single confidential piece of wisdom that provides the answer to all human happiness and success, that has been passed down and kept secret through the generations, passed down from, I try to remember this, from Aristotle to and the Buddha, to Jesus, to Leonardo da Vinci, to Einstein, and then to Rhonda Byrne, who wrote the book The Secret. And ruined it, really. But I don't know. It's just a guess, but I don't think that's probably how it happened. Anyway, there was a great study out of New York University a few years ago where, to illustrate this, the subjects were rendered mildly dehydrated. And then some of them were asked to visualize drinking an icy, refreshing glass of water. And everybody's energy levels were monitored using blood pressure as a proxy for their level of motivation. And the water visualizers experienced a decrease in their energy levels. It was as if, having convinced themselves in the realm of imagination that they'd already quenched their thirst, they were less motivated to go out and do it in reality. Sometimes when I bring up this anti-goal, anti-visualization stuff, people bring up something called the Yale study of goals, which you may have heard of. If you ever read any of these books that tells you you've got to set very clear, specific goals in order to win at life, they mention the Yale study of goals. The story is that in 1953, researchers asked the graduating students at Yale University how many of them had specific written down goals for the rest of their lives. And only 3% of them said that they did. And then 20 years later, the same researchers caught up with the same students and found that the 3% who had written down specific goals had amassed more financial wealth than the other 97% combined. And this finding is everywhere. It is in a very large number of books. Turns out there's a small methodological flaw with it, which is that it's completely made up. And if you ring the archivists at Yale University, as I did, first of all, they sigh down the phone because they've been asked this question before. But then they go and, double, triple check, and that no, it still doesn't exist. And it also doesn't exist at Harvard Business School in 1975, which is the other reference that sometimes crops up. This key dogma of goal setting, this key document that fuels the dogma of goal setting, appears to just be a figment of people's imagination. But I do want to accept that these things like affirmations and visualization are sort of an easy target. They're easy to mock, and that's why I enjoy doing so. But I think it's important. I think what I want to suggest is that we're all of us caught to some degree in this trap that one of the philosophers I write about calls the cult of optimism. Even if we wouldn't give any time to phrases in front of the mirror, or goal visualization, or walking barefoot across hot coals using the power of positive thinking like they do at Anthony Robbins' seminars, we still on some level think that happiness can only mean stamping out the negative. It can only mean asserting positive emotions, trying to guarantee positive outcomes. And the alternative perspective on this is very nicely summed up in a quote that is attributed to Edith Wharton. If only we'd stop trying so hard to be happy, we could have a pretty good time. I'm very glad, by the way, that I discovered a couple of weeks before the book went to the printer rather than after that she didn't say it at all. It was just a bunch of people on the internet who think that she did. So in the remainder of what I have to say, I'll just sketch out 3 of the stopping points, I suppose, that I made on this negative path to give you a sense of what I'm talking about. It turns out that this relentless focus on positive thinking is actually a very, very recent historical phenomenon. It goes back maybe a century and a half. Last year was the 60th anniversary of the publication of The Power of Positive Thinking by Norman Vincent Peale. It didn't start the whole thing, but it was there fairly near the beginning. If you go a lot further back into the various philosophical and spiritual traditions, you find a very different attitude towards negativity. So first of all, I discovered that there's a whole underground community of modern-day people who call themselves Stoics. Not in the sense that we use that term in Britain, certainly today, which means pretending that nothing bad is happening and repressing your emotions. But rather drawing on the Stoics of ancient Greece and Rome, who had a much more accommodating attitude towards negativity and how to deal with negative emotions. It's a very big philosophy. I'm not going to try and summarize it tonight, but one of the techniques they advocated that I really like is what they call the premeditation of evils. But you could think of it as negative visualization. Instead of focusing on the best case scenario, they say, sometimes it really pays to focus on how badly things could turn out. In modern psychology, it's called defensive pessimism, and the estimates are that about a third of us use it naturally. It comes naturally as a coping mechanism instead of optimism. See, we usually respond to anxiety or worry in ourselves or our kids or friends, whoever it is, with reassurance. So if somebody thinks everything is going to go catastrophically wrong, you want to try and persuade them that everything is going to work out well. But when you do that, you implicitly reinforce this other idea, which is that it would be absolutely terrible if they didn't turn out well. The Stoics say, you should deliberately do the opposite. Think through in calm and sober detail how badly things could actually go. You'll almost always conclude that they were less bad than you had been dimly thinking. You'll be able to marshal your resources for coping with them if they do occur. And as Seneca points out, it will also have another advantage, which is that it will make you appreciate all the things that you do currently enjoy if you regularly remind yourself that you could lose them. We read all the time now, I think, about psychology studies saying that gratitude is the secret to happiness, which is great. But if you're, if you're a bit of a grouch like me, it's hard to remember and to find ways to be grateful on a daily basis. Well, Seneca points out a really easy way that actually is in tune with a more pessimistic outlook on the world is to look at all the relationships and possessions that you enjoy and to remind yourself that you might not have them forever. In fact, in an ultimate sense, you definitely won't have them forever. You'll appreciate them all the more, you'll feel gratitude, and you'll be happy in a way that you could never have approached if all you'd been doing was trying to convince yourself that they'd be around forever and ever. Seneca says you should look at your closest relationships not as one of those things that cannot be taken away, but as though it were a jar or a crystal goblet. In other words, fragile and something you should cherish. You could even take this to the next level and deliberately bring about the worst-case scenario that you were worried about. Albert Ellis, the psychologist who was very heavily influenced by Stoicism and he died a few years ago, but I interviewed him for this book, and he used to say that if you're really scared of embarrassing yourself, you should embarrass yourself deliberately. So I did this because I am very scared of embarrassing myself, or at least I was before I did this exercise. He used to say you should do this on the New York subway. I ended up doing it on the London Underground. His advice was you should travel on the Underground, I'll say, and just speak out loud the names of each station as you approach them, so that everybody can hear. So it's terrifying to think about doing this. I mean, it's really a scary thought. But what's interesting about it is that it's not clear why it should be so scary. I mean, you're not proposing to harass anyone or attack anyone or verbally abuse anyone. You're sort of helping them, actually, right? I mean, you're telling them the name of the next station. But it is really terrifying to think about. And so the interesting thing about doing it is, well, actually it's pretty terrifying to do as well. But what's interesting is what doesn't happen. As soon as you do this, you realize you're not going to get arrested. You're not going to get attacked. The consequences that you experience don't remotely begin to justify the level of worry that you had going in. What happens is that a couple of people look up from their newspaper briefly and then look down again, thereby illustrating one of the fundamental findings of social psychology, which is that most people, most of the time, are thinking about themselves and not you. So you really don't need to be so self-conscious. Anyway, in this direct encounter between your beliefs about the consequences of embarrassment and the real consequences, your fears are cut down to size. You don't convince yourself that it's fun. I don't go around doing it as a matter of course. But the anxiety disperses, and actually for a few hours afterwards I felt great. The second of the stops on the negative path I wanted to talk about briefly, clearly Buddhism. At the point at which I got where I couldn't open a magazine, a book, or a newspaper without being told that I had to try mindfulness meditation, I booked myself on almost a week of silent meditation at a retreat center in Massachusetts. where I was woken at 5:30 every morning. You then try and follow your breath for about 9 hours a day. At first, it's a total nightmare. For the first, because you realize that when everything is quietened down around you, and you just try to quieten things down in your mind, all you can see is how extraordinarily noisy it is in there all the time. For the first 2 days of this retreat, I had almost nothing but the lyrics to the song Barbie Girl by Aqua going around in my head. I've never liked the song. I've never bought it. I've never seen them perform it. I've got no connection with it, but it just locked into my brain and wouldn't quit. Then lots of other thoughts and mental noise. But eventually something happens, and there's a sort of an opening, and you realize that actually trying to make your mind calm and tranquil isn't the point. That actually, in its own way, that will be a kind of positive thinking, an attempt to manipulate your inner experience. And that actually the point, if it even makes sense to talk about meditation having a point, various people I know would object to that, is to try and cultivate this idea that the Buddhists call non-attachment in the popular metaphor, to understand your thoughts and emotions like weather patterns, things that come and go, and that you don't need to push away the bad ones or cling hard to the good ones to make them stay, but to just be present with whatever comes up and less sort of dictated to by what's arising in your mind. The American Buddhist teacher Charlotte Beck puts it beautifully, I think, when she says that the point of meditation is not to change the contents of the container that is the mind, but to become a bigger container. And then the third and final example that I'll talk about tonight is of the benefits of turning towards negativity, is this now largely forgotten tradition of memento mori, the idea that there's something salutary and happiness-inducing about building in reminders of your mortality into daily life. I think it's probably uncontroversial to say that death is the ultimate example of a negative thing that we try not to think about where possible. Only then to find ourselves completely unprepared when we're forced to confront it in ourselves or in those close to us. In the 70s, famously, Ernest Becker, in his book The Denial of Death, argued that basically all meaningful human activity is an expression of the attempt to deny the truth that we're going to die. One of the things I did for the book was to spend a bit of time in Mexico around the Day of the Dead celebrations, which is completely fascinating, was for me anyway. It's important not to make sort of overly sweeping cultural generalizations, but there is something fascinating about the Day of the Dead if you're someone who's been brought up on a British tradition of Halloween, which is basically a celebration of chocolates. As far as I can make out, the Day of the Dead really is a celebration of mortality and death and of the deceased. In some offices in downtown Mexico City, I was told, people write poetry to each other, joke poetry to their colleagues, predicting how they think they're going to die. In the more traditional areas, I spent time in a more rural cemetery where families conduct these sort of all-night vigils. The whole village or town goes down to the cemetery. It's covered in marigold petals and candles. They sit at the graves of their particular relatives. They drink, they play music, they converse, not making light of death, but not being horrified by it either, just letting the spirit of it sort of seep back in to life in a very sort of easy and comfortable fashion. As you probably know, this used to be a lot more common, the traditions of memento mori in art, for example, including an image of the patron of the artist's skull in a picture so that he would be reminded that he too would die. A lot of the research recently into what's called terror management theory, what happens when people are reminded of their mortality, has tended to suggest that it makes them, in certain contexts, has sort of unpleasant effects on them. It makes them more authoritarian, and it makes them less tolerant of people who aren't like them. But there's been some more recent research to suggest that if you get the context right, it can have a much more beneficial effect. One of the studies that I really like here involved, as I understand it, some people taking a shortcut through a cemetery, and some people walking along a regular city street. And in both places where this occurred, the researchers had somebody talking on a mobile phone loudly about the importance of helping other people. In the lingo, they're sort of making that topic salient for anyone who passes by. And then one of the researchers pretends to drop her notes on the ground in both locations. And the people walking through the cemetery were 40% more likely to stop and help and pick up the dropped notes. It seems the hunch here is that death awareness in the right contexts triggers compassionate behavior, even though people don't know why that's happening. That when they're reminded of the one thing we all share, it sort of provokes us to reach out to other people. So just to finish off drawing these threads together, I think they're all different philosophies, they're all different approaches, but what these three things, Stoicism, Buddhism, Memento Mori, all share is this idea of a turning towards negativity instead of the positive thinking focus on stamping them out. I think it's really important, in closing, just to emphasize that this is not only, in my view, a sort of airy, wishy-washy, spiritual in a pejorative sense, way to live, but actually a really intensely practical approach to life. There's a researcher called Sarasvathy who's done some very interesting research into the way in which entrepreneurs who have proven track records of success, the way in which they think. And she finds that they naturally use these kind of Stoic techniques and similar things. They use the premeditation of evils. They call it. She calls it the principle of affordable loss. When you're trying to decide whether to do something, make some big choice, you don't ask, how certain am I that this is going to work out? Ask yourself, could I afford the consequences of it failing? And if the answer is that you could, then that should be all you need to know to take that action. Equally, they don't make these kind of detailed 5-year business plans. They tend to sort of laugh at the idea of business plans, at least in her research. They don't have a vision and then set about forcing reality to comply with it. They learn instead to act in a situation of uncertainty, to act without knowing exactly where they're going. The analogy that I really like is that they're less like gourmet chefs deciding on some extraordinary dish and then sourcing the ingredients from around the world. And they're much more like me or you, or me anyway, getting home from work at the end of the day, opening the cupboard and the fridge, seeing what's available, joining it together in some potentially interesting way, perhaps changing the definition of what you're making halfway through, and learning to keep moving forward without knowing exactly where it is that you're headed. And actually, just to finish, it's the same with writing a book. If, like me, you are a terrible procrastinator, if you listen to motivational coaches, Tony Robbins or the people I saw at Get Motivated, they would tell you that what you need to do to get over procrastination is to get motivated. You need to, first of all, get to the point where you really feel like doing the thing that you need to do. But of course, when you look at this from the perspective of the negative path, as I'm calling it, you see that makes things harder. You're adding a hurdle. You're requiring now not only that you have to do something, but that you have to feel like doing it as well. Which is a lot more tricky and much better. The only really good piece of anti-procrastination advice I ever received, it's in the book, but I also used it to write the book, is you don't have to feel like doing something in order to do it. If you know that something is important to you, it doesn't matter so much whether your mood at a given moment happens to be pumped up and ready to go. And if you look at the routines and rituals of very successful authors and artists, you never find that this involved standing in front of a mirror and pumping their fists and telling themselves they were going to write the best novel ever. What you find is that they set process goals instead of outcome goals. They say, I'm going to work for an hour a day or 5 hours a day, or I'm going to write 300 words a day, I think was Graham Greene's quota. My favourite one of these is the novelist Anthony Trollope, who wrote for 3 hours every day before he went to his job at the post office. And if he finished a novel in the middle of one 3-hour period, he just went on to the next one. Which is a real commitment to process, to not asking where am I headed, but just how am I going to put one foot in front of the other and do what I know needs to be done. So I'll just finish. I'll close with this quote that I think sums this all up. In the course of doing this book, I came to think of this guy Shoma Morita, who was a Japanese psychiatrist and writer. Came to think of him as sort of the ultimate anti-positive thinker. He was very influenced by Zen Buddhism, and this is his life advice. So if you want some advice out of this talk, I'll leave you with his. He says, "Give up on yourself. Begin taking action now while being neurotic or imperfect or a procrastinator or unhealthy or lazy or any other label by which you inaccurately describe yourself. Go ahead and be the best imperfect person you can be and get started on those things you want to accomplish before you die." Which I think is hardcore advice. It feels unsparing and unforgiving, but I think it's ultimately very, very wise. If you prefer, you can go to an Anthony Robbins seminar and take your shoes off and walk barefoot across hot coals using only the power of positive thinking to stop yourself burning. They did that in San Jose a few months ago, and 20 people had to be hospitalized because they burnt their feet, because that's what happens when you walk barefoot over hot coals. That's all I've got to say. Thank you very much for listening. Thank you.